right, I am here with Ron Thomas, who is about to take part in the ceremony today for the Black Sportswriters Hall of Fame. In a few moments here, famous for his work covering the NBA for USA Today, among many other accomplishments. Also wrote a book about clearing the lane and the impact of black players in the NBA. Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for your time. What does it mean to you to be inducted into this Hall of Fame?
Well, when I came into the business, there were just very, very few black sports writers working for um, white-owned media. And so to see how, first of all, the growth in our numbers has been tremendous. But to see three of my colleagues and myself have really lengthy careers and have been given the opportunity and taken advantage of it to have significant beats as reporters or to run a large department like Gary Howard did with the Milwaukee Journal really shows how much progress has been made. And and it's wonderful, of course, to be honored by your own in Black Sports Writers Hall of Fame. So I'm very glad to be a member of it now and to go on with three other people who I respect so much.
In terms of your career, I mean, looking back on it, you may have answered my question a little bit just then, but what are the things you're most proud of in terms of what you were able to achieve during your career?
Well, I got into this career specifically because I love sports, but I also felt that in sports you had an area where people would be willing to read about, talk about racial discrimination. And so a lot of my work has sort of focused on eradicating that. So I'm really proud of the series. I did several series about the lack of black head coaches in football and baseball, managers in baseball. So that's partly it. I think another is, for me, I ended up switching careers in 2007 and becoming a professor. I'm the original director of the Morehouse College journalism program, and it started with nothing, really. It's Spike Lee's idea and Ralph Wiley's idea. And after 19 years, we're a major now, and we've got 74 majors and like about 15 minors and 115 former students who are working in the media or in sports. So I think that's a tremendous contribution to both fields that we've been able to make. And in general, I tried to be entertaining. I covered mostly on the West Coast. I've covered the 49ers, I've covered Raiders games, I've been a beat reporter for the Warriors, covered a lot of Giants games, and Dusty Baker and Barry Bonds were there. And when I grew up in Buffalo, there was a writer named Steve Weller, who was my favorite columnist, and he was quite funny. And so I think he seeped into my brain, and I've tried to be entertaining and funny when I could be. I just hope reading my stuff day to day, readers enjoyed it.
I know you mentioned your style a little bit, trying to add some humor into your writing. How were you able to effectively balance utilizing humor while also tackling some of the serious issues you mentioned in terms of, giving minorities, fair opportunity, allowing for those doors to be opened and, other serious issues like that?
Well, you use a style that's appropriate for the story. If I'm writing about lack of managers or head coaches or even athletic directors, if I'm writing about that, then obviously I take a very serious approach. And the humor really might be sarcastic humor, if I have humor in it. But if I'm just writing a game story and something funny happens, or as I'm writing it, a funny line comes to mind, or someone gives me a fun quote or a creative quote, then I'll just put it in the story, the place where I think is most effective. And one thing about being a sports writer that I've enjoyed greatly is that not only are you writing, which I love, but you have more creativity as a sports writer than in other aspects of the business. So you really do get a chance to develop a style. And I call it my students playing with words. Finding the best word to use at that particular spot in your story, and sports just gives you more material for that. So I've really enjoyed the ride.
I know I mentioned it briefly there, but your book about clearing the lane.
Mhm.
In terms of writing that book, I mean, how did you go about that process from being, a newspaper writer to, writing a large scale book like that?
Mm. That's a very good question because I had not thought of myself as being an author. It wasn't necessarily a goal, but I had written a series about the first black players in the NBA in 1987 for the San Francisco Chronicle, and the readers really responded well to it. They really enjoyed it. They sent me ideas. They were saying, "Hey, if you ever do more on this, you should write about Cleo Hill at Winston-Salem State and his NBA career." And so it just seemed like this something. And I had never read anything about the first black players in the NBA except for one story about a guy named Chuck Cooper, who was the first drafted. So it was just this area of historical exploration that was wide open, and out of curious. And I've always been interested in history. It turned out to be the perfect thing for me to write. So it's called "They Cleared the Lane: The NBA's Black Pioneers," and it's been out about 20 years now, but it's still very current because it's history.
In terms of your career, I know this might be a difficult question to answer, but what have been maybe your favorite stories to write or favorite athletes or coaches to interact with, those kind of things?
I'd say favorite. I loved Magic Johnson. I could watch him every day, all day. So I would say of my favorite players, Magic Johnson. Um, Favorite coaches to cover, I would say Al Attles, who was the first pro coach I covered and helped me a great deal throughout my career in a myriad of ways, including helped provide me with contacts for my book. But just a wonderful man who died a couple of years ago. And then in terms of coaches, it'd be Dusty Baker. And he's a joy to cover because he enjoys talking to the media. He always has a story for everything and a nickname for everybody. And he's just a genuinely nice person. So I would say those come to mind right away.
In terms of your legacy, I mean, how would you like for the younger generation to view you in terms of what you were able to do and your impact on this industry?
Well, I think in terms of looking at racial discrimination in this country in sports, I brought some insights to it and some perspectives to it that were unique. So I think that's a major contribution for me. I think in general, I really love history. I had since I was a kid, and a lot of my pieces have been historical pieces. When Kurt Flood died, I wrote a little bit about him, and just talking about how his court cases resulted in players getting free agency, which obviously changed the world of sports forever. And so other contributions, I wrote this story about one of the very first women's basketball games. It was between Stanford and Cal, and I can't remember which one won, but they won 2-1. And it was really just about, what society was like in terms of women in sports at the time, but just a different type of story. And so I think I've contributed a lot to history of sports in general, and I think I just like writing about it, and I think
There you
and I
go.
think people learned a lot about whatever it might be their favorite team or the game they watched last night. I was a beat reporter mainly, and that's what I enjoyed it.
I know you talked about it a little bit, how you were mentioning how when you were earlier on in your career, there weren't too many black sports writers that were writing for, I guess, non historically black publications.
Hmm.
How would you describe how, when you entered that situation, what it was like and how this industry has evolved, into more current times, if you will?
Well, I was very fortunate because um, particularly my editors when I first got into the business, they were very, very supportive I never felt I had to deal with racism at all. And Frank Cardin was at the Rochester Times-Union, was my first editor. The second was Ray Sons at Chicago Daily News, who had covered the Bears before that. And they were just wonderful people to work for. And so by the time I ended up going to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1978, I had my confidence as a writer. And so once you get your confidence, then if things don't work out, you can move on somewhere else. Somebody will want you. But I've had friends who like dropped out of the business or had to leave their job or move to another city because they had sports editors who were not allowing them to reach their potential. And I did not run into that situation. So that was very critical to my career and to the length of my career.
I know you mentioned also being an educator for some time now, but if you had to give advice to a young journalist, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, one, you have to work hard, and you have to know that you're going to have, particularly in sports, you're not going to have a normal life because you're going to be working at nights. You're going to be when everyone else is eating turkey dinner. You're going to be covering the Thanksgiving game. I mean, it's very different. Puts a lot of strains on your family. I think you have to love it enough to ignore the fact that you probably are not going to make a whole lot of money. I mean, if you get on TV and all that stuff, fine. But average reporter, no, not like being a corporate lawyer who makes a lot of money. And that's part of it. And I read this recently. It said, "Be yourself. Everybody else is taken." And I think that's a great quote. And the journey, I guess, is finding out who yourself is. What are you most comfortable doing? What captures your attention? Like for me, was the topic of my book. Are you a columnist? Are you a writer? Do you really prefer to work inside as a copy editor? Are you editor material? What fits your personality and your talents? And if you learn who you are and what your strengths are, then that will help guide your career.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. And again, congratulations on being into this Hall of Fame.
Well, thank you very much.